subscribers asked me a question just recently. What were the collapse of the Soviet Union? Why did it happen? And instead of writing him a letter, I decided to explain it and make a video as to why the Soviet Union collapsed. So it's a very complex topic, but usually in the West there is this standard explanation that it was the United States that won in the Cold War by forcing the Soviet Union to spend more money on armaments, and it went bankrupt. Nonsense. It has nothing to do with it. Another explanation is that the Afghan war also cost so much money that it sort of exhausted the resources of the Soviet Union and it collapsed. Actually, nobody would have thought at that time that I was in this business of Soviet studies for a long time and was a professor of Soviet studies. Nobody at that time thought the Soviet Union would collapse. So it was a totally unexpected event, and then people didn't know how to explain it and started saying, well, it's the victory of the Americans. Nothing of the sort. So let me briefly explain it to you in a short possible way, why, and a few other things, but long-term reasons is the most important ones. Now, in a nutshell, in one sentence, if you press me and say, why did the Soviet Union collapse? The answer is this. The Soviet Communist Party was incapable to continue to govern. It was too old, too imbecile, too incomprehending of the situation and the realities of new age, that it was simply showed its incapacity to govern, and it split. But this is a little simplistic, so let me go into a little bit deeper into this. Now, long-term reasons, one of the key things here to understand is how the Soviet Union was set up, because it is in its setup that there was already the seed of its destruction. Now, it was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which assumed that it was a union, a voluntary union. But even then, in the anthem, it says, the Union of Soviet Free Republics united by Russia forever. So this sort of an acknowledgement that Russia was number one, that it was more than equal than others, that it actually controlled things. In reality, of course, the Bolsheviks, in a long protracted civil war, conquered areas that were called borderlands and made them into Soviet republics. So essentially, in reality, it was Russian Empire reconstructed on a new basis, and instead of the Tsar and its ministers, you had the Communist Party and its Politbureau that controlled the situation, but it continued to be empire. However, it was set up as if it is a free union. And to prove it, they created this kind of a structure of the Supreme Soviet as being the parliament for everybody, but then every republic duplicated that, and there was also the Supreme Soviet of Ukraine, Supreme Soviet of Kazakhstan, Supreme Soviet of all the other republics. So they're a very strange system. On the one hand, total power was in the hands of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, controlled by Stalin. On the other hand, there were these sort of union republics with their legislatures which didn't do nothing at all. It was totally useless waste of any effort. And that there were communist parties, Communist Party of Ukraine, Communist Party of Belarus, Communist Party of Kazakhstan, etc. But they were really departments of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So when I say there was a problem with the way it was set up, is that if you can imagine a situation that one day the Communist Party of the Soviet Union would be weak for whatever reason, the Soviet Union would be weak too. And if it collapses, the party, then the Soviet Union would collapse as well. And this is sort of what happened, but a little more complicated. So, the most important thing to understand is also, what did the Communist Party do? What was its raison d'etre? Why did it exist? It existed to fulfill the will of Comrade Stalin, and that basically in practical terms means to run the industry, and this is the departments that were running industry, both through the ministries of the government and through the first secretary of the regional party committee. Second thing, it was to run agriculture. Third thing, it was to run security, which is KGB and NKVD. And the fourth thing was to build up the army and to defend the country if it ever came to war. So these four functions, this is what the Communist Party did. Now, Stalin terrorized everybody into submission, and the as-if component didn't really matter because he controlled everything in his hands through this police apparatus by killing as many as necessary. But let's follow what happened to the Communist Party after Stalin died. One of the most important things that happened is that it got stupider, if you want to put it in a nasty way. In other words, these people who Stalin surrounded himself with, they were imbeciles, they were peasant upstarts, they were not educated, they didn't understand what was going on. They convinced themselves that they knew Marxism, and Marxists proved that their system, socialism, is ahead of capitalism. That's what Khrushchev tried to say from the United Nations podium. They convinced themselves that they're already ahead, and there's nothing they have to do because they are the vanguard of the people of the proletariat, and the future is guaranteed. Well, as we know, it didn't work out this way. The key thing about the 1960s and 70s is that the party continued to be narrow-minded, self-perpetuating, bureaucratic elite that recruited members of not very, through corruption and career opportunities. And the Russian society became ever more sophisticated, to which you could see some of the videos that I showed in this series about culture of the 1960s and 70s. I asked a question whether there was a stagnation, and there was none. It was the flourishing, it was a recovery of Russian intellectual life. In other words, to put it in Marxist terms, there was a growing contradiction between the Communist Party as a ruling elite and the awakening society that wanted to ask questions: who is to blame for the death of the millions? Why did you, the Communist Party, usurp the power that belongs to all the people? Why are the Soviets, that's supposed to be elected by all the people, are in fact staffed by the appointees of the KGB? And the question list went on and on and on. That gave rise to the dissident movement, and it got stronger and stronger. And this is what brings us to the resolution of this conflict in 1985, when the Communist Party realized it's too old and incapable, and appointed Gorbachev to be the first secretary and to reform the system and save the situation from the collapse that they knew might be coming. Now, the short-term reasons basically is the contradiction between Gorbachev as the head of the CPSU, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and Yeltsyn, the leader of the reformist flank of the Russian Communist Party. Now, to make it short and simple, I would put it like this. Yeltsyn took the position within the Russian Communist Party of a leader of a democratic opposition. So he identified and put his power and ambition and his fate into the side of those who wanted to have Western-style liberal democracy, Western-style capitalism, with prosperity, with democracy, all the things that they were dreaming of, thinking as Sakharov had taught, that there would be a convergence of socialism and capitalism, that there would be capitalism with a human face and socialism with a human face, and there would be private enterprise, but there would be democracy and human rights. So this is the kind of association that Yeltsyn was seeing, regardless of what he did in the 1990s. That is what his position was in 1988 when he was fighting against Gorbachev. Gorbachev, even though he had the same ideals of restructuring and democracy and empowering of the people and the new thinking, he really was in the ideological terms just like Yeltsyn, but he was the leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and those people around him didn't want any of this. People in the KGB, people in the army, people in the administrative apparatus didn't want any of this reform. In fact, I wrote an article in 1988 in the Problems of Communism, you can look it up if you want, which is called The Communist Party Secretaries and Endangered Species. In this article, I wrote that if things go the way they were going, the Communist Party would have nothing to do, because they used to run the economy and collect harvest from the peasants and order the enterprises how much to produce of this and how much to produce of that. If you go to market reforms, then they would have absolutely no raison d'être, no reason to exist, and they would have to collapse. So this is exactly what happened. And that brings me to this reason. one of the few, of short-term reason. The Communist Party ran out of things to do, because the more you liberate the economy, the more you allow people to produce themselves and to think themselves and to ask questions, the less you need the centralized bureaucratic elite that is called the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So this is what happened. Now, the next point about the short-term reasons is the Baltics, of course. The Baltics were incorporated into the Soviet Union by essentially an act of aggression by a Nazi-Soviet pact, and the Baltics were, since they created the same structure in the Baltics as everywhere else, Communist Party of Estonia, Communist Party of Latvia, blah, 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 what happened in the 50s and 60s, they were taken over by the intelligentsia of these countries, and they wanted now to secede. They wanted to exercise their as-if right to secede from the Soviet Union, and they did it. The first one was Lithuania. So now the Soviet leadership had to answer a question. What are you going to do? Are you going to abide by the constitution of the USSR that people could leave if they wanted to? Or are you going to use force? They preferred to use force, and then of course this was the famous moment when Yeltsyn stood on a tank and denounced the committee that was supposed to overthrow Gorbachev and hold military power in their own hands and preserve the Soviet Union. So the short-term reason is that the Baltics were a kind of a catalyst, or if you want to put it, a Trojan horse, which kind of gave free rein to the forces of others who wanted democracy and freedom and independence from themselves. Now, what I'm going to say now is totally unknown in the West, and this is the most important reason of all, if I were to put it this way. What is not understood in the West, that the key champion of democracy and human rights and the movement to liberate the country from the rule of the corrupt oligarchy of the Communist Party was the Russian intelligentsia. It was the movement of the Russian people, of the Russian intelligentsia, that wanted to create, following Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, to create free Russia. So what they don't know in the West is that there were demonstrations in 1989-90 in Russia, that in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, which was done Leningrad, for your freedom and our. In other words, they were totally for the independence of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They wanted to have them their freedom and to have themselves their freedom. And Yeltsyn identified with these people. So in a sense, shouldn't be forgotten, it was Russia that left the Soviet Union. It was Russia that actually initiated the breakup of the Soviet Union, because Soviet Union at that moment was associated with Gorbachev and the generals behind him, and therefore it is the head of Ukraine, Belarus, and Gorbachev got together and signed the pact in December 1990 that they are going to split away from the Soviet Union, and therefore it ceased to exist, and Gorbachev resigned. But this is not the end of it. Let me explain one more important thing. Once the split occurred, it should be understood that everywhere there were the same kind of people who stayed in power. It was the Communist Party under different name, because in the Baltics it was the national intelligentsia that wanted democracy that stayed in power, but in Ukraine and in Belarus it is the same communists who stayed in power. Lukashenko is still in power. He was the chairman of the Kolkhoz collective farm. He was staunchly communist. He was one of those retrograde, hardcore communists who seized power in Belarus and continued to exercise it. And he was not the only one. It's the same thing, the Aliyev family. His father was the general secretary, member of the Politbureau in Azerbaijan. Today his son is running the country as the president. So it's the same kind of local elites that seized power, and they used to be communists, but then they renamed themselves very quickly, and they were really for what they were. They were national, local elites that seized power under the Brezhnev's policy of localization and stability of the cadres. And the same thing everywhere in Central Asia. You basically have Nazarbaev, who served forever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It shows the same pattern. Everywhere in these republics, local communist elites seize power, rename themselves into nationalists, and continue to rule and build up their corrupt networks. Now, corruption is key to it, because the reason the Communist Party of the Soviet Union could not run the show is because it was corrupt. And in that sense, Afghan war just showed how corrupt it was. So collapse of the Soviet Union unleashed those corrupt elites that started to divide up the pie, and they keep on fighting to the present day over the borders, over the privileges, and so forth. So, to finish up, the Soviet Union collapsed because of the Communist Party. What happened after that? The incapacity of the Soviet Union to rule generated local wars, generated continued corruption, including in Russia, generated horrible rule of oligarchs in Russia in the 1990s, and the dream of democracy and freedom and justice for all was postponed for several decades, and it's sort of beginning to emerge in Russia again as a champion of those things under President Putin. And don't believe what the Western propaganda tells you about Putin. He is one of the best things that ever happened to Russia, but I will have a different video on that. Thank you.